Well, in this short video, we're going to talk about human resource recruitment. In a past video, which if you haven't watched that already, I encourage you to do so, we discussed human resource planning. So specifically, we're talking about how do we determine what the needs are for the organization. So we conducted a job analysis, right? We got detailed information about the jobs. We forecasted our supply of labor as well as the demand of labor. And then lastly, we matched the two, right? We want to be consistent and ultimately be staffing our organization with demand in mind, obviously. We don't want people standing around. We want to utilize those resources effectively. And so if we identify a need or a gap that needs to be filled, then we go on to the recruitment phase. And the recruitment phase, obviously, we are trying to get qualified applicants to apply for our organization, right? That's really, we're trying to identify people that can fill needs in the organization, right? Vacancies, jobs. And then we're trying to attract those individuals. We're trying to get them to apply for those jobs. And historically, organizations that are very well known, very reputable, that have a history of treating employees well, paying them well, offering them great benefits, have a very easy time recruiting because of signaling theory. They signal to the environment based upon the fact that I pay well and provide you these benefits and fair treatment. It signals to the workforce, or to the applicant pool, I should say, that that's a pretty good place to work. And so obviously I would want to apply there. And so organizations that can get more applicants into the pool have a much easier time getting highly qualified and highly trained employees just by sheer numbers, right? If you can generate hundreds of thousands of applicants, chances are, just based on sheer probability, you're probably going to find, several people in there that are going to be very, very qualified for that job, are going to be a very good fit. But if you can only attract 10 to 15, well, maybe you're not going to get the best of the best. You might find some good people in there, but you're not going to get that top echelon there that organizations really want to achieve. So let's talk about specific recruitment sources. Okay, what can organizations do to get people to apply? There's two primary sources that organizations will look to. First thing is we're going to look internally. Right, we're going to take a look at our existing employees, people that already work for our organization. And the reason we're going to do this, there's actually several different reasons. But the first reason is that these individuals, these current employees, already have an existing knowledge about our organization. And this is something that really can't be overlooked and should be emphasized very heavily, is you want people to know about the organization and what the culture is like and how to interact in an organizational setting. Right? Whenever you get hired onto a job in a new position, particularly when you're just part of an organization for the first time, you get hired, and there are a lot of things that you have to adapt to. Right? You can look at the employee handbook and all those different things, but you really can't get a feel for the culture until you start working there, right? You figure out, what are the methods of communication, right? Kind of those informal channels. You figure out, how to, act in certain settings, right? You have to observe the behavior of your coworkers and how they interact with management, right? To see what's okay behavior. You kind of see how people send emails, so you can tailor the way that you send your emails and the way you structure and the way that you word them so that you're consistent with everyone else, right? Those aren't things that you can read in an employee handbook. You have to observe them and you have to be involved in the culture to figure those things out. And so the benefit for the organization is that if I already know this employee is familiar with the culture, I can immediately bypass those things, right? I don't have to worry about hiring an employee and all of a sudden them not meshing well and assimilating into the culture very well and then having to leave the organization because they've already are a part of it. And so that is a very, very big benefit that a lot of times is overlooked, but is certainly an advantage of internal recruiting. Now, in addition to that, because employees are already internal, they already work for the organization, okay? They also have knowledge about vacancies. And I would say not just knowledge, but they have a more intimate knowledge than people that are applying outside of the organization. And I'll explain what this kind of refers to and what this looks like here. When a job is posted, right? Particularly through internal means, right? Through a job posting. So you're communicating information about the vacancy on company bulletin boards, employee publications, corporate intranets, really anything else that employees can access, whether it's an email that goes out to the entire organization, right? Chances are employees already know what are the tasks, duties, responsibilities, but also they've probably interacted with someone who has held that position. And so they have a more intimate knowledge of what really the job entails. Maybe some things that aren't really stated in the job description or on the job specification, right? Now, if you're outside the organization, you don't have that benefit, right? You're going strictly what's on paper and you're trying to gauge and formulate an opinion in your mind as to if there's going to be a fit there for you. Now, the benefit, of course, for the organization is if you have an employee that applies, then you can almost assume that they at least believe that they're a good fit. And chances are that they probably are a good fit as well because they have a more intimate knowledge of the job than really people outside the organization do. And so that's the trade-off there, is if you go external, if we hire people from the outside or at least recruit from the outside, then there always is that concern that we hire them, we determine that they are the best fit for the position, and we hire them, and ultimately they don't realize what they're getting into, right? Because there's a lot of things, those other duties as a sign section, right? It's very vague in general, and that gets kind of detailed once the job starts, and so that can be a little bit of an issue here. Now, the last thing is that internal recruiting is much cheaper, so you deal with the cost aspect. You can recruit internally for a fraction of the cost that you would recruit outside of the organization. So instead of posting and advertising in various different types of recruitment tools and recruitment websites, or going through recruitment firms and those different types of things, you already have the people that you're trying to attract in front of you, right? They're your employees. You know already how to reach them, right? Through company intranets, through bulletin boards, through employee publications. So it's a very, very cost-effective means of recruiting as opposed to external. Now, although it's more expensive, external recruiting, there comes a time where there is certainly a need for it. Obviously, we discussed in lectures past that if you cannot find qualified applicants inside the organization, then obviously you have to recruit externally. You have to look outside of the organization to actually staff certain positions. And you might not want to resort to this initially off the bat. And for the reasons that I identified before, you have to also consider the motivational piece. If you are in an organization and that company is constantly bringing in new people for certain positions that you're interested in, that could be extremely demotivating. Because especially if you want to move up, you want to progress up the hierarchy in that organization, and they're not giving you the opportunity to, you may look at that job as a dead end, and that may require you to look outside of the organization and pursue other options for employment. And if you are a solid employee with good performance, strong productivity, a high-performing employee, right, that organization should try and do everything they can to keep you there within reason, of course. Because it's going to take so much and cost so much to ultimately replace you to get a person into the position, to train them, and there's no guarantee they're going to perform as well as you did in that role. So a motivational piece, internal or promoting from within, is very, very important. A lot of times in the interview process, right, that's a big question, right? Do you promote from within? If so, at what rate, right? Because they want to know, do we look internally or are we always looking external? Which is good sometimes because you do get fresh perspective, you get new blood in as well. So there's a couple different things that we look at for external recruiting, and each of these has a certain cost to it, right? So one of them is we have what we call direct applicants. And direct applicants are people who apply for vacancies really without prompting from the organization. So if you go online to a certain business and you submit a resume and submit a cover letter and type in some information, and it's not for a job posting, you just submit that, you weren't prompted to do so, that would be an example of a direct applicant. Now, Obviously, direct applicants in terms of cost are very, very minimal because you don't really have to attract them. Simply by your company having brand recognition and being well known in a certain field, you've attracted them, but they're not applying for a specific position per se. Another area you look for external recruiting are referrals. Referrals generally are very good in terms of effectiveness. And the reason is referrals typically come from current employees. So if you're like myself, chances are you're probably not going to refer someone who's going to make you look bad, right? I have probably only referred like 3 people ever my entire life because I'm so fearful of that person making me look bad that I really need to make sure that they meet all the criteria. And plus, I know what type of personality and who is needed on the job and what would be a good fit for the organization. So companies love employee referrals because the chances are you already did the work to make sure that that employee is going to be a high-performing employee and going to be a good applicant because you don't want to make yourself look bad. A lot of times, too, organizations provide employee hire bonuses, right? If you recruit somebody, they end up getting hired, and they survive for a certain period of time, usually like a 90-day probation period, you receive some type of bonus. And it can be, anywhere from, a couple $100s to potentially a few thousand, depending upon the position. And so that's obviously a way of, generating applicants, but also making sure that they fit with the organization because employees know what the culture is like. They know what type of personality will mesh, who will work well with others, who won't. And ultimately, we only want to recommend people that are going to make us look good, obviously. You can also look at other sources as well, right? You look at advertising. Advertising is generally pretty effective, but you also have to deal with the cost aspect. Some advertising is more expensive than others. So you talk about, well, do we do radio? Do we do television? Do we do internet advertising? Do we do newspapers? And then there's always issues that happen. For example, newspaper advertisements are generally don't attract the right people that you're trying to look for. And so what you have to deal with, or what you have to consider, I should say, is what's the demographic of the person that's looking at that, right? If you are a technology company and you're recruiting in the newspaper, that might not be consistent, right? Because your demographic may not be reading the newspaper. They might be looking at online publications, right? And so you have to consider that as well. That introduces some additional issues there too. A couple more that I'll highlight just for time's sake, and then we'll finish up here. But a good one is career fairs. Career fairs are commonly done on college campuses, right? Particularly four-year universities. You get individuals and college students, they're going to be graduating, and so we recruit there for kind of entry-level positions. Can be very, very effective. Is a cost to that, of course, because you have to generally have somebody fly out to a certain location or drive to a certain location. There's typically a day in lost productivity, and usually they're just answering questions and different things. So the effectiveness of it may not be as effective as referrals or a company website, for example, but they generally do fairly well. The other thing is you can go through employment agencies. And these can be very expensive, especially when hiring for executive positions. But employment agencies is essentially an outside organization, and you outsource the recruiting function to them. And so they're in charge of actually the hiring process, or not the hiring process, but they're in charge of identifying applicants, of course, identifying employees, potential employees, and then ultimately bringing them together, screening them based upon certain criteria, and then if they pass that criteria, they move on to interview with you. And so you get people that are somewhat screened, but maybe not in the fashion that you would have wanted to. So this may be effective because they go through a screening process. However, the cost is something that has to be considered. And that's really the trade-off that you're going through here is how effective is the recruitment method or the recruitment source, whether it's a referral, whether it's a rehire, whether it's an employment agency, whether it's a career fair, versus ultimately what's it cost me? And you have to consider those trade-offs. And sometimes it makes sense to go one route, sometimes it makes sense to go the other. But usually, what does make sense all the time is to focus on internal recruiting first, seeing if you can identify a highly trained and skilled employee inside the organization already. And if all else fails, you always have the option of looking outside the organization.